Thank you to everyone who is tuning in to this online and listening in. For those of you who know me, I'm sorry I'm going to bore you again. For those of you who don't know me, should be an adventure. Uh, what I'm going to talk today about is an archaeological site which was actually excavated over 30 years ago. But it's become of greater interest more recently for a number of reasons that I'll bring up as I talk. But in particular, because it looks as if it was a particular event that happened once off in the Western Cape some 2,000 years ago, and it involved the deaths of 12 people. So it's quite a different thing from a normal archaeological site. In normal archaeological sites, we're talking about burials over a long period of time. This may very well have been an event that happened all at once, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. So let me take you through a little bit of the early excavations at the site, where it is and what's so important about it. The site is called RSSAf. It's a rock shelter just east of Eland's Bay, north of Cape Town. So it's about 2 hours drive or so north of Cape Town. The cave itself is in a line of mountains that run along here as part of that Cape Folded Belt. Eland's Bay is here on the coast. Clan William is inland a bit. There's the little village of Grafwater, and the cave is just to the east of Grafwater. It was excavated in 1987 and 88. At the time, it was a very interesting excavation with a lot of important information coming out of it, but it was not thought to be anything particularly important. It was another later Stone Age rock shelter site on the Western Cape. The archaeological report with some physical anthropology attached to it was published in 1993. So this was research done, as I said, essentially 30 years ago. The cave itself is high up on the ridge, and you can see here it's about 300 meters above sea level. The cave faces west, and when you're up in the cave, as this picture on the bottom right shows, you've got this spectacular view across the view all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. It's about 30 kilometers distance. So whoever was in this cave at 2,000 years ago had a wonderful view of the countryside, and it's pretty typical for locations where prehistoric hunter-gatherers had operated from in the past. The cave itself, when they excavated it, presented one immediate problem. The archaeological site was not discovered by archaeologists. It was in fact discovered by the landowner who owned the farm. He had built a wall, which you'll see in a few minutes, to keep some stock. If he had some stock up on top of it, he could literally put them in there for the night. But the cave deposits, he had gone and he had dug two rather large holes at the back of the cave. This is the view of the cave as it was in 1987. You can see a little on this side, you can see some of the material easing off there. This is one of the holes that he dug. And here is the archaeologist's map. Here is the walls that were built in the rock shelter. Here's the grid laid out by the archaeologist. And here's hole number one, which was the big one done by, sorry, back up a bit. Dug out by the farmer, and then there was another hole here which looks like it was some sort of animal hole that again the farmer had dug out and widened. So the farmer had already disturbed this quite significantly when the archaeologists were informed about it. In fact, the farmer, the landowner, had discovered 7 skeletons which he'd removed from the site and kept at his house, plus a whole bunch of archaeological material, beautifully preserved archaeological material, arrows with little stone points on them, lots of string made, some leather, bound leather, some notched arrows, really quite rich material, all mixed together. And this was in the farmer's house when the archaeologists got there. When they laid out their grid, their excavations occurred mostly in squares C3 and C4, and in that area, they recovered another 5 skeletons. So the original fieldwork from the 1980s was 5 skeletons excavated by the archaeologists and 7 skeletons dug out without archaeological context by the farmer. Now, the archaeology, when they went into it, the big shock to the archaeologists was that when they discovered the human remains, and this is the area of the farmer's original hole. These are the grid areas which have been dug out by the laid out by the archaeologists. And within the grid, as they went down in CN4, there was this huge set of bones. At first, it looked like the bones were all jumbled together, but then they realized these were a set of isolated individuals. So this is one individual here. This is the second individual here. In total, they uncovered 5 individuals, all in close proximity, but it wasn't possible to say, was this a single pit? Was it a series of graves? Was it one large grave? What was it? They really couldn't tell. They did identify the burials as separate individuals, but they couldn't identify whether they were in a particular grave pit at the time. The big excitement back in 1993, when their paper was published, was the radiocarbon dates. They had taken samples from 6 of the skeletons, and they'd sent them off for radiocarbon dates. And when they came back, every one of the 6 radiocarbon dates fell within a 100-year bracket of roughly 2,100 years ago. And this was something very special. Here were all these individuals, all literally within 100 years of each other. If it was multiple burials, it still was individuals who were living maybe between 2,100 years ago and 2,000 years ago, and buried in that context, all in one location at one time. Now, in the 1993 paper, there were 4 major conclusions or 4 major observations they made that we need to be aware of. First was that all of the burials, all these 7 burials, all came from what had been layer 2. Layer 2, when it was the animal bone and the non-human material was dated within that, all came out at about 2,100 years ago. So that lens, that appearance of archaeological material at 2,000, all was in one layer 2,100 years ago. This beautiful cultural material dug out by the farmer turned out to be much more recent. In fact, it probably was within the last 1,000, 1,500 years ago, somewhere around there. It was probably 1,000 years younger. Yes, got it right. Younger than the skeletons. So it is unrelated to the skeletons. So clearly the cave was in occupation at around 2,000 years ago when the bodies were buried there, but there were people living later on, at least 1,000 years later, and all that beautiful cultural material was not linked to the burials. In fact, there were no grave goods which could be linked to any of the specific burials. There just was nothing. They were bodies, but no grave goods with them. And once again, the archaeologists at the time, they suspected this could be a single burial, a single event, but there was no proof. They just simply couldn't identify whether this was a single pit or a multiple set of burials. Very interesting, but at that point, kind of just another interesting site to add to our body of knowledge about the later Stone Age in the Western Cape. Now, that's the way it stood. Publication was done in 1993. And then my colleague at UCT in Department of Archaeology, John Parkington, got involved long after this in 2014. John had been reviewing sites in the Western Cape, and he had looked at the reports for Ferroscope, and it bothered him. The 2 things bothered him was, what were the chances of 6 individuals having nearly identical radiocarbon dates all lumped in together around the same time? And also, why were all the burials, both those from the farmer and the excavated burials from the archaeologists, why were they clumped so closely into one location? And this bothered him. He said, this doesn't strike me as a long-term occupation. This strikes me as something which is something that happened very quickly over one period of time. So he applied to the NRF African Origins Program, received granting, and John decided he would set up a project to look again at this archaeological site. Although the work had been done 20 odd years earlier, he wanted to look at it again. Amongst the first thing he did is put together a team of people. And there's a photograph here. We all went up one afternoon to the site. There's John. There's the wall that the farmer had built. The cave is into the right. I can't see everyone in the picture for all of it. This is Nsantla Dlamini, who you'll meet again in a few moments. But we all went up and had a look, and we discussed how we were going to do this. And the decision was that the team would look at 5 things. The first would be to re-examine the original field notes with Tony Manhire, who was the archaeologist who was working at the time, and reassess the interment of the skeletons. Tony was not sure about the grave pit, but John said, fine, we'll look at it. It's 25 years later. Let's look at it again, new set of eyes, look at the way these bodies are buried and see whether we can identify that grave pit or not. So that was the first object. And obviously John Parkington took the main role within that. The second thing was to say, well, we had dates for 6 skeletons, but we've got 12 skeletons. So John said, fine, let's radiocarbon date the rest of the skeletons so that we've got a set of 12 dates, and we can again see whether all of these skeletons, all 12, come from the same time. We knew 6 did. What about the other 6? Then he wanted to reanalyze the original 1988 date on the physical anthropology. And this is important because they had sat for 25 years, and now it was an opportunity for a group of people, who I'll introduce you to in a moment, to actually lay out the skeletons and look again and say, is there anything that we missed when we looked at this just after the excavation? Then something new. By 2014, it was possible to start talking about ancient DNA. So John proposed that we take samples for DNA and see what comes out of those from the skeletons. And lastly, he wanted to look at the site as a whole in terms of the stable carbon isotopes, the sedimentation within the site. They call it the biochemical geology of the site, if you wanted to call it that. Now, of these, 3 of them, and I've highlighted them in yellow, are the ones that I wanted to talk about today. The dating, the analysis of the skeletons, and the analysis of the DNA. So let's have a look at that. Yeah. First, the dates. At the top of this table, you'll see original 6 dates from the 1988 excavation. The 6 dates averaged, this is uncalibrated, they averaged to 2,102 years ago, with a range from about 2257, 2,250 down to about 1850, 1900 years ago. So there's quite a bit of an overlap. You need to understand where the radiocarbon date is a statistical entity. It's not an absolute. So we often talk about a radiocarbon date. That's just the average. And actually the date can be anywhere between the limits of upper and lower limits. The date could fall anywhere within that. It's a statistical measurement done with the C14. So that was the dates that came out in those 6 individuals. John ran an additional 7 new dates. Interestingly enough, it wasn't intentional at the time, but the analysis of the skeletons hadn't been completed, and John ended up radiocarboning the same individual twice, once for the skull and once for the postcranials. This time when he did the analysis, the date was almost the same. The average 2,103 years ago, but the upper and lower limits had actually tightened. It's between about 2150 and 1950, somewhere around there in terms of in the order of 2,000 years ago. Taken together, all 12 dates averaged 2,100 years ago, with a range from about 22,200 years to about 1,900 years. That's averaged for the 12 dates. John has gone to a great deal about talking about how to manipulate the dates, how to figure out how accurate they are. But Possibly because these people were eating marine foods, it's likely that the dates are probably about a 50-year overestimate. So probably rather than an average of 2,100 years, these are probably somewhere in the range of about 2,050 years. It really doesn't matter. We can't pinpoint the exact moment, but what is critical here is that everyone, all 12 dates are overlapped statistically. It is completely possible that we're looking at just one date, and this is just the noise from repeated radiocarboning. So the evidence from the new dates came now just enforced what we'd had from 1993. It was suspicious that the 6 individuals all came together. Now we have 12 individuals, all with virtually identical radiocarbon dates. Now to the job of the skeletons. And this job went to Ntlantla Dlamini, who was at that time one of my PhD students. She actually graduated in the year that she was doing this analysis. This was something done on the side. But Ntlantla took the effort of going in, taking the boxes out, laying out the skeletons in the lab. And this is the first time the skeletons had been looked at in any serious way in 25 years. So Ntlantla laid out every individual. And what was critical to her was because 7 of the skeletons had been disturbed and brought in by the farmer, and only 5 were in archaeological context. She now had to make sure that she had every individual in order, were the bones mixed. And in fact, she did discover right away that there was one particular problem. The original report in 1988 had said there were 13 skeletons. Ntlantla very quickly discovered that, in fact, what it was one of the skulls, in fact, which was a separate skull, actually belonged to one of the postcranial skeletons. So it reduced the number to 12. But more importantly, Ntlantla looked at the bone fractures. And this is something that had changed between 1988 and 2014. What happened at UCT, particular around 2005, 2010 in there, our lab at University of Cape Town became very interested in forensics. Now we started to work, we had always done a little bit of forensic analysis for the pathology people, but now we instituted a thing called forensic anthropology. Cape Town and our lab was doing police cases now on a regular basis. When you're doing forensic cases, it's quite different from doing archaeological cases. Archaeological cases, what you want to look at is open-ended at anything. When you're doing forensic cases, there's ultimately only 2 questions that you're asking. One is, who is this person? And the other question is, what happened at the events of death? Such an approach, which we'd never really been looking at 20 years earlier, Ntlantla was very much involved in, and she said, okay, let's look at this as if there's a forensic case. So now we need to know in detail, who is this person and what were the events surrounding death? One of the ways of looking at surrounding death was to look at the nature of the fractures, the broken bones. Nearly all archaeological skeletons are broken in some way just from soil pressure. So you can divide the breaks normally into 2 kinds. Antemortem, those breaks that occurred during the life of the individual and have become healed, and you actually see that. You can actually look at the bone and find the signs of healing. Or postmortem. Postmortem is when the bone dries out, it becomes harder, becomes more fragile, and it tends to break and fracture. But there's another kind of fracture, which we weren't really looking for in the 1980s. But because we've been involved in forensics so much now, this was something that all of us were very attuned to. This is called perimortem fractures. These are fractures which happen to the bone in or around the time of death. And the difference is they are going to show no signs of healing because the individual didn't live through this, but they also show signs of the bone being rich in organic material. It's fresh bone. When it fractures with radiating cracks. The kinds of breakages are different than happen on older, drier bones. So it's quite possible to look at these bones and now say, let's see if we can find all 3 of these fractures, the postmortem, the antemortem, and particularly the perimortem, to the bone, the fractures that happen around the time of death, because that's going to tell us something about those events of death. So this was Ntlantla's job. And over a period of a few weeks, she went through all of these. I'm going to quickly show you her catalog of the 12 individuals. It'll give you an idea. I seem to be rocking. I hope you got, there we go, that's better. If you look, you can lay these out. Adult male number 1, Atlanta managed to associate a skull with that one. That was, I think, one of the ones that gave us the double into the new individual. And you can see adult male, male 40 to 50, male 30 to 40, a child, and we couldn't sex the child between 6 and 8 years old. But when we did the ancient DNA work, when we did the genetic work, this individual popped up as male on genetic grounds. So that's interesting. Then there was another adult we couldn't sex. There was no pelvis recovered. A female 20 to 25, another male 30 to 40, another child, this one very young, 2 to 3. And then lastly, a set of these are the ones which were excavated in context by the archaeologists. So these are very nicely excavated. We know who they were in terms of the burial position. A male 40 to 45, a female 25 to 30, another female 30 to 35, and a male 40 to 50. So it's quite a range of people. There's a couple of children, there's some men and some women. Some of the individuals are young adults in their 20s, early 30s, perhaps. Many of them are older adults in their 40s or into their 50s. So it's almost like a whole group of, a whole band representing by old and young, male and female, adult and juvenile. Then when Atlanta started to look in detail at the fractures, she picked up a number of really interesting things on these. Number one is she looked at all of the bones from below the head, and she couldn't find the sign of one perimortem fracture. There were some postmortem fractures, broken up bones, but nothing that said this bone was green, it was fresh when it was broken. Yet when she looked at the skulls, 4 of the 8 skulls that she had showed crush injuries with radiating fractures, which are classic cranial fractures in perimortem times with radiating breaks all around. I'm giving you some pictures at the bottom here. This is, I just used the one example from her work. And this is individual Ferris Cop 2, individual UCT 386. And you see that what's missing is half of the face, part of the back of the skull is broken. But this is, you can see here, there's a fracture across the side of the face. That's a green fracture. That's one that's happened. And in fact, all of this is broken away. All of this damage to the face is perimortem damage. It happened around the time of death. The bones have been lost subsequently. Then if you look along the side here, you can see some of these radiating fractures, these radiating along here, pieces of the bone broken away, lost, another fracture here, one running along the base of the skull. And they're actually even more easy to see when you look at them from behind and from the top. Here's this radiating fracture running all the way across the length of the skull. That does not happen when bones are dry and old. This is what happens when bones are fresh. Here's another view from the top, and you can see that radiating fracture going along here and breaking in these lines. There were 2 other skulls which had breaks, but they weren't well enough preserved to identify whether they were perimortem or postmortem. And what was also interesting is that there's both men and women present in this. It's not all men or it's not all women. This is a mixed sex group showing these injuries. Now, she only has 8 skulls, and of the 8 skulls, 4 show classic blunt injury damage, 2 probably, and the others we're not sure of. But that's, even if we just take the 4, that's 50% of the individuals which could be studied showed perimortem fractures and the really quite strong signs of violence. But could this be, is it violence or is it accident? Could this have been a group of people sitting in a cave when the roof collapsed? Well, that certainly would generate some of the injuries you'd see. You would also expect to see postcranial breaks. But more importantly, there's no sign of any rock fall within the cave. These bodies are buried in soft sediment. There's no rocks falling. It really doesn't look like it. Also, the nature of where the breaks happen is pretty typical for crime scenes you would see in today's world. So these are people who have been hit, no other way to describe it. And we refer to it often, this is extensive blunt force injury. These people were beaten with something. Some of it could be stones, it's hard to tell. There's a couple of injuries which look like they might be sticks, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes and what that means. Well, now we had a situation where we had resorted the skeletons. We had picked up this sign of violence on the bones. Question we still had to go back to and say, who were these people? Now, in South Africa, we first tried to do some ancient DNA back about 2002, and it failed miserably. But later on attempts, I think the first attempt we got with a decent mitochondrial DNA sequence was 2014. The year that we were looking on these skeletons was also the year we published the first time that we have a mitochondrial DNA sample from an ancient skeleton. So this was quite an important thing. And John linked with Johannes Krauses out of Leipzig in Germany. And he got one of Raj Ramasar's genetic students, Tasneem Salih, to work with Johannes. She was funded, she flew out to Germany, and she spent the time in Germany actually running the analysis. So it was one of our own people doing the analysis. And the object was to get two pieces of information if she could. One was to confirm sex identification, particularly for the ones who were on morphological grounds who couldn't quite be sure whether we had a man or a woman. And then secondly, to identify the origin of the mitochondrial DNA, because this is something that had been done with living Khoisan people a lot, and we had quite a bit of knowledge by that point of the distribution of mitochondrial DNA amongst Khoisan people. So we managed to get 7 individuals. The photograph you can see here is Johannes Krause in his lab suit, trying not to get his own DNA mixed up with the sample. Here is Nikki Illing from microbiology at main campus, John Parkington, Raj Ramasar, and here's Tasneem Salih, who would do all the hard work coming up, and I'm the guy behind the camera. Well, in the end, Tasneem did manage to get 7 mitochondrial samples, and there were some very interesting things we learned from them. One is that there was surprise, there was at least 3 maternal lineages. Perhaps it was a wrong assumption, but we kind of assumed that if this was one band, then all the women would be related. Well, this doesn't look like it's the case. There's 3 quite distinct matrilineal lineages, L0D1, L0D2, and LOF. What it's telling us is that this group is probably organized patrilineally. It's probably the men who are closely related, and the women are coming in and marrying into the group, hence the multiple lines of maternal origin coming through. One of the women and 2 of the children look like they were very closely related. The others we really couldn't tell. And lastly, the haplotypes we were getting, which were all L0, all were consistent with other Khoisan groups in Southern Africa, and particularly the L0D, very, very common amongst foragers, hunter-gatherers within modern Khoisan communities. So got some information out of it. I don't think you really do. You can read that if you want. It's just showing us how we got the particular haplotypes for each other. I think that's not really important. What's really important is to look at it and say, well, what happened? We know some things. This is what we know. 1, the cluster of dating, the burial location, and the presence of a number of individuals with perimortem fractures strongly suggests that this is one event. We can never absolutely prove it, but it's just there are no other likely scenarios. These individuals all overlap in time. It's just odd if you think different individuals would have been killed by violence and then taken up at different times and buried in the cave. That doesn't sound particularly logical either. And lastly, the burials, John looked at those in detail, and he's convinced it is indeed one pit but with individuals placed separately within it. 4 of the people died of blunt injury to the head. At least 2 more probably died of the same effect, blunt injury to the head. We don't actually know how the others died. There's no sign of sharp injury, which would be an arrow point or a knife point or something like that. There's no sign of that. The injuries are all blunt. But what's really interesting is all 12 of these people were buried with some care. Although John thinks this is one burial pit in that sense, these people are not thrown into the pit. They're carefully placed there close together. Somebody put a lot of effort into ensuring that these people were properly buried. The genetic evidence suggests that these were probably Khoisan foragers and probably all related. Once again, we can't prove it. So here we've got a group of people, 12 of whom were killed probably not far away from this site because they're buried there all together. They're buried, ceremony is not the right word, but they're buried with care. A number of them died of violence, and it looks like it's all one event in time. That's what we think we know at present. So how do we interpret it? Well, it so happens that not only has forensics become a main field, over the same time period, all the way from about 2000 to right up to 2020 on this, 2 researchers, myself and Susan Pfeiffer, then University of Toronto, we were independently looking at signs of perimortem injuries in skeletons coming from archaeological context. We've both become very interested in this. So working independently between the 2 of us, we uncovered 14 cases from 14 different sites around South Africa, all later Stone Age, and all showing signs of violent death. I put 2 from my cases down at the bottom here. I don't know how clear this is. This is actually a skeleton recovered by John Parkington back in the early 80s, but here in it, there's a bone arrowhead stuck in the back of the vertebral column. When we analyze the skeleton, there's no question, this was a young woman in her 20s, and these arrows were shot into her back while she was in a prone position. Somebody stood over her with a bow and arrow and put 2 arrows into her back. There's no other way to interpret that. It's a violent death. Another one's from a coastal site on the south coast. This individual ended up with 2 localized fractures on the top of the skull, hitting on the top of the skull, very localized. This looks like digging stick. It looks like the end of a stick that somebody's jammed into them. There's no signs of healing. There's internal fracturing, so this is pretty much happened during the green phase when the bone was still fresh. So this probably was a cause of death. That's my guess. Susan, in another case of hers, found 3 individuals buried, again, with signs of digging stick injuries on the skulls. So this is something that is not uncommon. And it's so interesting because we've been pumped a myth about foraging, Khoisan foragers in Southern Africa, about how they've come from this gentle society, and yet here is evidence in the later Stone Age and repeated cases in different sites, all with people been killed. It wasn't males, it's not just men fighting, the victims are women, children, and men. But most of them, to a large degree, most of them occur between the period about 2,000 years ago and about 3,000 years ago, which is absolutely consistent with Pharaoh's Skull. 2 cases used arrows, and I've got one illustrated there. Most of them were blunt force trauma using digging or knobbed sticks. Well, how do we interpret this? What's it telling us? Well, a lot of us have talked about it since, and basically there's a hypothesis of why violence should be happening in the later Stone Age in this place and this time. John favors the idea that violence in the West Cape is linked to the arrival of Khoisan people. The pastoralists moving to the area between about 2,500 and 2,000 years ago. His sites that he's worked on suggest that the hunter-gatherers at this point were under some stress themselves. And it may have been that as the pastoralists moved into the lowland areas where the grass was good for the stock, these foragers were pushed up into the marginal areas, up onto the hills, away from the area, and the amount of area they had to forage in had decreased. One of the things John picked up in the West Coast sites is that tortoise shells, as time went on, between about 3,000 and 2,000 years ago, the size of the tortoises being collected got smaller and smaller. And this looks as if people are putting more intensive activity into gathering food. The tortoises don't have time to get big because they're being collected for food before they reach their full adult size. And this suggests that this would be a motive. This is about resources. It's about two groups of people living in an environment in which there was a resource stress, and it ended up in violence. We simply don't know. We don't know if the Farascop people were killed by herders or another group of foragers. We don't know whether this was a conflict over local resources or grand resources in terms of access to different areas that are being excluded from. And in fact, we will never know the answer. Whoever did this got away with it. We're not going to find out who did it. But what it does show us is that if we use scientific techniques, and we put a lot of really good observation and good people in to do the observation, what it does is it tells us about stories of events in the past. What Farascop is so important now, our new vision of Farascop, is precisely because it's a flash in time around 2,000 years ago of an event that ended up in the death of 12 people, but was an extremely important event in terms of us understanding what life was like back 2,000 years ago. That's more or less what I wanted to tell you about. I wanted to say thanks to a few people. Number one, thanks to the Royal Society for organizing the talk. Special thanks to Intlanta Dlamini and Tasneem Salih, who did all the hard work gathering the data on the skeletons and in the lab with the ancient DNA. Raj Ramasar, Johannes Krauser, Alyssus Mitnick, Chiara Barbieri, Belinda Speed all gave of their expertise. But one person I've got to thank is John Parkington, because he won't let go until his itch is scratched. And that is the reason the whole project at Farascop took off, was because of John's curiosity. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Alan. Very, very interesting talk. Are there any questions? If you have a question, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Might I put my hand up?
Yeah, yes, go ahead.
Okay, I've got a couple of questions. First of all, is there any evidence on the bones of scavenging, for example, by jackals and hyenas, which are presumably were common in that area? That's question number one. And question number two, who would have gone to the lengths of actually digging the hole and burying these people in this way? Why would they have done this? Assuming they were murdered somewhere else and then brought to this particular site. Who would have done that and why? Well, I'd like to hear speculation on those two questions, please.
All right. Well, it doesn't look as if there was any scavenger activity on the bones. The bones are actually really good preservation. One of the skeletons still has sinew on one of the legs. It's dried tissue. It's really just the membrane surrounding the muscle. But here it is 2,000 years later, and this is still preserved from desiccation. Yes. Who buried the bodies? This is one we've talked a lot about. I think most of us at this stage think that this is a part of a group of hunter-gatherers who got caught in a bad situation. This site is 300 meters up, well, 250 meters from ground level up. It's a hard climb, and carrying 12 bodies up seems really unlikely. Our bet is that these people were killed somewhere very close to the cave or in the cave. And our feeling is that this is part of a band. And perhaps a day later, or even on the same day after the event, the other members of the clan came back and buried the bodies. The soil in the cave is very soft, very easy to dig. But there's lots of places down below with similar soil that would be very easy to dig and bury a body. It just strikes me as unlikely, but not impossible, that 12 bodies were dragged up 250 meters to the top of this rock shelter and then buried within the rock shelter. It doesn't strike me as possible. There's another thing too. There's a gap. Looks like nobody's living. There's a gap between layer 1 and layer 2 of probably in the order of 1,000 years. And then all of a sudden, the cave is busy again. Lots of people in it, all those archaeological materials, no bodies, but lots of archaeological materials, arrows, bedding, food remains, string, all of this stuff is there. So clearly people were living in the cave, but there's a long gap between layer 2 and layer 1 occupation. So that would suggest to me, perhaps the locals in the area knew this was a place that something bad had happened and didn't come back for a while. Unfortunately, it's going to be pure speculation. I like speculation, it's great fun, but I must remind everybody that it is the realm of science fiction.
Thank you. Other questions? Devin?
Thanks, Bert. Alan, thanks very much for a very interesting talk. What I wanted to ask is, you mentioned that there were at least 14 other instances of this type of violence in sort of the same general temporal period. I just wondered if you suspected that there might be other archaeological excavations that could benefit from this forensic approach, where we might have perhaps missed this kind of reconstruction, very much like this case as you presented. Do you know of any? Do you suspect any?
Well, I suspect that's exactly what's happening. I can't speak for Susan. I know she's listening, but I can't speak for Susan. I know that a lot of her students have become involved in this kind of thing, and she has gotten involved in the analysis of sites, and she's also finding signs of violence within her sites. If this is the case, Susan and I, and in fact, John and I disagree a little bit on this. I think my guess is that hunter-gatherers always had a component of violence, because living as a hunter-gatherer, the land and particularly water accessibility is something which is very limited. And it's going to be an issue. There's always going to be some contestation over something to do with resources. We haven't seen it amongst modern peoples, but we're seeing it archaeologically in a number of cases. There's a big site in Kenya that's got even more dead from these circumstances, similar circumstances. And it strikes me as if this is always just subsurface. And what's subsurface is not that people are particularly nasty or violent to each other, but resources are something which triggers it. I think this is something we could look at in terms of broad systems. As resources around the world become lower, we've got more wars and more conflict, but that's been going on from small scale societies, doesn't take just big scale societies. The other thing too is that virtually all of the students who are currently active, to a large degree, have either been trained either by me or Susan. And I think both of us have infected a lot of students with this thing of a forensic approach. There's nothing wrong with it, except for the fact that it's very frustrating because you'll never find the perpetrator, ever. But the techniques are the same. The big difference between a bioarchaeology study and a forensic study is limited to those two key questions. The bioarchaeology study is kind of open-ended. You're talking about the community from which those individuals are drawn rather than the individuals themselves. In forensics, it's all about the person, what happened. In bioarchaeology is, what is this telling us about the community and how they live? So there's the techniques are nearly identical, but the questions being asked are a little bit different.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Alan.
Thank you. I've got a question something you mentioned, like sort of casually. You said that in the C14 analysis that because the people were living on seafood, there was something different from living from a different diet.
You're gonna have to get John Parkington to come and talk. This is a big thing. In our papers that we've written, John has spent pages talking about this. The bottom line is this: is that there's an underlying assumption that a radiocarbon date is an absolute date. We call it that, but in fact, it's actually a cluster of analyses on the one sample. So it's a statistical thing, and if it's a mean with two standard deviations, the actual date could fall anywhere within that. The other thing too is that the analysis, I mentioned one skeleton got dated twice. There's 150 years in difference in the dates. So either somehow or other his head is 150 years older than his body, which doesn't strike me as likely. Either that, or you can see the fuzziness in the technique of radiocarbon dating. The other thing that impacts on radiocarbon dating is the diets of the people. It's the nature in the C12, C13 ratios in the bone. And that will change the way your C14 ratings will come out. This is now out of my area. You have to ask John or one of the other archaeologists about it. But the bottom line is if an individual is eating a lot of marine food, it effectively ages their bones in terms of the radiocarbon analysis. So the radiocarbon analysis overestimates their age, something to do with the nature of marine diet. So if you're going to correct the date, if your individuals have been eating a lot of marine foods, then you've got to make the individuals a little bit younger because it's been biased to be older.
But
the analysis that John did, sorry?
Is it then because the isotope ratio is different for seafood compared to?
Yes, there's
okay.
three different isotopes, C4, C3, and marine. And the problem is that impacts on the radiocarbon date. But John seems to think there's quite a few, quite a bit of marine diet in these guys. So he would argue towards a little bit more recent, but it doesn't change anything. It still means if it happened at 2,000 years ago or 2,100 years ago, it's still a single event. And that's the thing that has become so exciting about it.
No, it was interesting because I'm a chemist and we always speak about natural abundance of isotopes. But clearly there is apparently not such a thing as a natural abundance. It's depending on where you source your material from.
Right.
There are two more questions. Susan?
Thank you. Thank you, Alan. Really interesting. Nice to see you. A couple of things. The thing about the marine carbon is that carbon in the marine system is simply older because it doesn't cycle the way terrestrial carbon does. And Emma Loftus, who's also with us today, Emma has done some wonderful work on this. She and I have a paper that's in press in Current Anthropology that looks at the Southwest Coast skeleton dates and pulls them together very nicely in the context of corrections for the marine diet. But Alan, I'd like to ask a couple of things. Do you have, oh yes, and with regard to Devin's question, a recent publication that you could find in PLOS One is work that Emma and I and others did on a site called Lagoon Beach, which is Milkbus Strand. And again, there's some parallels with Ferroscope. Alan, do you have any comments about the missing crania at Ferroscope? And also, completely different, why, do you have any speculation on why perimortem trauma is less often seen, hardly ever, along the South Coast? Is it because they were more territorial?
You know, they're kind of open questions. The first one is Or the second question about perimortem trauma being more common in one place or other. I still think that this is a generic thing about hunter-gatherers, and it's going to flare up from time to time, depending on the circumstances and everything else. We have never looked for it. Basically, I mean, I wrote something with Marina Stain some years ago on the history of paleopathology, and there's almost nothing in Africa before 1950 because people simply didn't look. They were interested in age, race, and sex, and basically, if they discovered a skeleton, that was the report. And if there was a pathology, sometimes it might get reported, often it didn't. Then what happened afterwards is that people started to look with different eyes, and that's come up again. I think the whole rise of forensic anthropology has infected us, if that's the right word, to look for things that we simply hadn't looked at before. So linking to the point that Devin made, I'm guessing that the more time students spend with these skeletons looking more carefully, they're going to find more cases. I think that's what's been happening up until now, and I think that process is probably going to continue.
I'm not so sure that nobody has looked, Alan. I've looked. You don't publish a paper on what you don't see. If there's no perimortem trauma, you're not going to you're not going to give a talk at a conference saying, here's what I didn't see and I looked. It's a very tricky thing dealing with absence of evidence. So, but I wouldn't underestimate the amount of attention that the collections representing the southern coast, like the materials that are housed at Florisbad and such. There's been quite a bit of study of that material.
The good news
with that kind of attention.
Yeah.
Anyway,
the good news is more and more people are looking. Susan, I already forgot the first question. That's all right.
The skulls, the missing heads.
Oh, the missing skull.
Skull.
Look at there are 7 missing skulls. No, 6 missing skulls on the site. John is convinced that the farmer hasn't told us about everything he's done. And also he has a feeling the farmer kind of gave away interesting specimens to friends. There is a Roycott hole. There has been some animal burrowing, not when the bones were fresh, but obviously much later in time. So there has been disturbance, which probably explains a lot of the postcranial bones missing. But short of the fact that these individuals were decapitated and then buried, well, the answer always, it could be, but we have no cultural information up till now which suggested that that's a likely occurrence in the Western Cape.
Okay, in view of the time, I'll allow one more question. Robin, crew.
Thank you very much for that extremely interesting exploration of the site. I wanted to ask you whether you can distinguish burial sites from this collection of skeletons which has been found in the cave. Thank you.
Robin, I'm not absolutely sure what you mean. In the actual burial sites in the cave?
I mean, can you distinguish something which looks like a burial site from a burial site in the sense of some ceremony or full activity having taken place when the bodies were buried, as opposed to simply burying a set of individuals who've been killed? Thank you.
Right. Okay, I do understand now. Yes, there's some patterns. I mean, for example, amongst the hunter-gatherers in prehistoric South Africa, it's pretty clearly that people were buried in a particular body position. They were folded into almost a fetal position. There could be a very good technical reason for that. It means you dig a smaller hole. But in other cases, bodies are laid out. And in essence, when we've got bodies that are laid out or in a non-standard pattern, they often are bodies that have been buried quickly. Bodies that have been buried with ceremony, people will take the time to put them in a fetal position, sit them up. We've had individuals that are sitting up in the grave with grave goods surrounding the bottom. So it's generally pretty easy to see whether this is an accidental burial or a quick burial, or whether it's some kind of formal burial. What we don't know is, of course, the particular ceremonies that would go along with a burial. We can guess. For example, we often find fragments of pottery in graves, which suggest, like are still being done in Southern Africa, offerings of water or alcohol in a pot are put on the grave still today. And that may have been happening several thousand years ago in societies that had pottery at that stage. So the short answer is yes, you usually can pick up signs that there's been some kind of ceremony around the burial. We just don't know exactly what the ceremony is.
All right, thank you very much. It was a very interesting talk. I would like to once more advertise our next talk that will be on 19th of April by Dr. Michelle Lochner. And with that, I wish you a good evening, and I'll make the talk available on the Royal Society website in the next couple of days. Thank you and bye-bye.
Good night. Thank you. Bye-bye all.